According to some scientists, if Britain had gone into lockdown a week earlier, half the lives lost to COVID-19 would have been saved. According to others, this is all because the government dithered and delayed in the face of the clear scientific advice. But are they right? Let's discuss. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. I've said before that one of the easiest ways to criticise anybody if they do something right is to say that they should have done it sooner. So if somebody acted in good faith, followed the advice, and then took action, but, with the benefit of perfect 2020 hindsight, they could have done it sooner, you should give them that. But if they didn't act in good faith, or they got advice and ignored it, or any other number of culpable nonsense that may have happened before they took action way too late, then that would be a fair point. When we're looking at responses to COVID-19, there's still a lot we don't know and a lot of disagreement about what even were the right actions. This week we heard in the UK about the first wave of unemployment coming from the lockdown. We expect to see a lot more. We've seen the worst plunge in economic performance in history, and we know it's going to get ugly. Could we have done it differently? Professor James Porterba, Professor of Economics at MIT, told a House of Commons Select Committee, "I think we are coming to a more nuanced understanding of policy options than we had even 3 months ago. In particular, some of the recent research that has been done suggests that a more targeted strategy for shutdown or restricting interaction within the population can be very effective at reducing loss of life while having a somewhat smaller economic cost than broad-based shutdown." And that makes sense. But let's be clear, except for Sweden, most every other country followed a broadly similar ultimate response to the pandemic than we did. So let's for now take it that was a reasonable response. If it wasn't, what we did wasn't less mistaken than what others did. The question is, did 20,000 people die needlessly because Boris Johnson and the government dithered and delayed? This recently got a high profile because of comments by Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, whose model predicting 500,000 deaths in the UK was credited, some would say blamed, with turning government policy towards the lockdown in the first place. Speaking to the same House of Commons Select Committee, he said this.
It was doubling every 3 to 4 days before lockdown interventions were introduced. So had we introduced lockdown measures a week earlier, we would have reduced the final death toll by at least a half. So whilst I think the measures, given what we knew about this virus then, in terms of its transmission and its lethality, were warranted, I wouldn't second guess them at this point. Certainly, had we introduced them earlier, we would have seen many fewer deaths.
He makes the claim that we could have saved half the lives by moving a week earlier. He doesn't support the dither and delay narrative. He doesn't claim the government didn't listen to the scientists. He said it was reasonable with what was known at the time. And this was a similar message to that given by another of the government scientific advisors on the SAGE group, Professor John Edmonds of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He said this to the BBC.
When you look back on this episode, whether you have some regrets about some of your advice or what you thought at the time?
Yes, we should have gone into lockdown earlier. I think it would have been hard to do it. I think the data that we were dealing with in the early parts of March and our kind of situational awareness was really quite poor. And so I think it would have been very hard to pull the trigger at that point. But I wish we had. I wish we had gone into lockdown earlier. I think that has, cost a lot of lives, unfortunately.
So neither of these were arguing that the government should have moved earlier. Both said that, given what was known at the time, it would have been hard to do. It's others that have jumped on this evidence because they say, were demanding an earlier lockdown. And if only Boris Johnson had listened to them, then all of those lives would have been saved. Piers Morgan is the highest profile of these, and indeed he was doing just that. On March the 16th, 1 week before the full UK lockdown, he was ripping into Johnson over ridiculous coronavirus delay. New York, he said, was closing its schools, bars and restaurants. On that day, Johnson did a broadcast to tell the public to stop all non-essential travel, to work from home where possible, to avoid pubs, clubs and theatres. It was 4 days later he closed those venues by law, and then 3 days after that when we went into full lockdown. So there's a couple of parts to this that we need to look at. First, is it right that 1 week earlier would have saved half the lives? Second, is it true that this represented unreasonable, culpable delay? Just because Piers Morgan thinks so isn't really the criteria. It comes down to the scientific advice that was being received. Did they ignore advice to move more quickly? Let's start with the first part. Ferguson said that the epidemic was doubling every 3 to 4 days before lockdown. Other scientists have said the same thing. The implication is that lockdown then started to make the difference, and that difference equated to half of the people who died. It's fair to say that some are sceptical of Neil Ferguson's words on this. His model, after all, has been widely criticised over recent months. His initial prediction of 500,000 deaths in the UK were clearly well ahead of anything that we've seen happening in the world. His model had certain assumptions built in about how virulent the pandemic would be and would remain, and how many of the population would be susceptible to it, and it didn't match what happened. So is his assessment on the scale of the problem to be trusted? Well, let's assume he's been learning lessons along with the rest of us over the last couple of months. Part of the problem is that we don't have reliable data about how many people were infected when. Such data would only be available if there had been a comprehensive regime of random testing of a significant proportion of the population. Britain certainly didn't have such a programme. Really, neither did anyone else at the scale you would need, for the very real and practical reason that global competition for testing equipment made it a limited resource, even though some countries did do better than others. But we do have some better data, which comes from the numbers of deaths. Even if it's not perfect, as evidenced by the fact that different countries attributed deaths to COVID-19 on a very different basis. Some would record all deaths where COVID-19 was a factor, and others just where it seemed to be the primary cause of death. And others ignored a bunch of uncertain cases, some of which certainly would have been counted if they'd been assessed, and some countries' figures you can't trust in the slightest. A recent paper by Professor Simon Wood at Bristol University took what we now know about the average length of time between infection and death in fatal cases and the percentage of cases that result in fatalities, and used that information to reconstruct an infection timeline for the UK. And that study shows something very interesting, which is that, if it's correct, the UK had already passed the peak of infection before lockdown took place. You have to add some caveats. If the assumptions about the average time from infection to death are wrong, then the location of the curve is wrong. But those assumptions are consistent with what we currently know about the virus. Why would that have happened, given that we were pretty sure that the UK was nowhere near herd immunity? The obvious answer to that is it's a reflection of the fact we didn't all just carry on with business as usual up until the day the Prime Minister announced total lockdown. In fact, there were measures introduced before total lockdown, and citizens and institutions started to adapt their own behaviour well in advance of compulsion. This timeline showing public transport usage provides an interesting proxy indicator to show how activity was declining well in advance of the lockdown announcement. Now, some of the sceptics take this further and say this shows that lockdown actually had no effect at all. We could have stayed with the same sort of measures that were taken by Sweden, they say, where they kept shops and bars open with social distancing restrictions and just a ban on large gatherings. For instance, Toby Young of the Lockdown Skeptics website said this: "Far from imposing the lockdown a week earlier, these data suggest it wasn't necessary to impose it at all. Infections were falling before it was introduced and would have continued to fall just as they did after peaking in those countries that didn't impose a lockdown, like Sweden and Belarus, as well as those US states that avoided locking down." I find that an appealing position. I would like to believe it, but as I've often said, that's exactly when you should scrutinise the evidence more carefully, because you'll tend to want to fool yourself. And the truth is, it's not really supported by this evidence. The lockdown sceptics may become more strongly supported as the true cost of lockdown becomes evident to us all over the coming months and years. But in the terms of that specific argument, is it really true that it made no difference? The point is that many people and companies were already voluntarily preempting the lockdown measures with their own behaviour. Could we have had a different mix of lockdown measures that would have been better? Well, almost certainly, as we've already heard that Professor Paterba told the Select Committee. But to say it had no impact, that's a different proposition. To support that case, sceptics often show the course of how the rates in England and Sweden track each other. That's the proof, they say. England locked down, Sweden didn't, and they followed the same path. But that's not really right. First of all, it's absurd to say that lockdown makes no difference. Ultimately, if people don't get exposed to each other, the virus can't spread. The example of New Zealand shows that done effectively, of course lockdown works. The question is whether you have to go that far. There is a case to be made that if the culture of a country won't go with the discipline of lockdown, then you'd give yourself most of the pain without much of the gain. And that may be what happened in the UK, because there must be some reason why lockdown actually delivered a very poor result for Britain. In other European countries, they had pronounced downward slopes after their outbreak reached its peak. The shape of Britain's outbreak was of a much slower downward curve, and it remained stubbornly high. That can't be blamed purely on the proposition that the country was a week later to act than it should have been. Slowness to act might have meant we would have had a taller spike, but not such a longer one. It's also getting increasingly difficult to suggest that Sweden's experience acts as a model for the rest, given that their infection rate has remained stubbornly plateaued, by and large, quite high. By the way, don't be fooled by this graph. The recent bump in cases comes with a big ramping up of testing that's been going on, so it's not quite as bad as that graph suggests. The UK is one of the most densely populated countries in Europe, just behind Belgium, which was the worst hit so far in terms of deaths per capita. Sweden is one of the least densely populated, right along with its neighbours Finland, Norway and Iceland. All of those countries did massively better in terms of keeping deaths low compared to Sweden, which is currently catching up with the worst performers, having overtaken France and due soon to overtake Italy in terms of deaths per capita. Interestingly, Norway has also identified that its cases were in decline before it imposed lockdown, and it's asking itself how much of a process was necessary. We're going to have a lot more information to work with in the future for sure. So remember, all conclusions are preliminary, whoever's giving them. Hopefully some of the information to come might actually explain why, compared to Belgium, Italy, Spain, Germany and the rest, the UK's decline of cases has been a lot slower. The one question that gets a lot harder, though, it seems to me, is the one that says we would have cut the death toll in half by moving to a full lockdown a week earlier. That does seem to be undermined by Professor Wood's graph, because it shows that the preemptive lockdown measures people were already taking were having the expected impact already. So how different would those declines have been if full lockdown had been applied at the start? Imperial's model of how they thought lockdown affected the infection rate certainly would have made a big difference. Their cliff face graph, if it had really looked like that, then yeah, the sooner you do that, the better. But it's hard to relate those lines to the changes in behaviours that we saw in reality with public transport and the observed evidence that informed the Professor Wood study. And the most reliable data is surely that which is observed in the real world, not projections produced on computer models. So this goes some way to answering the second charge. If thousands of lives weren't lost because of the lateness in going to the full lockdown, then that weakens the Piers Morgan's case in as much as it focuses on when lockdown was applied. However, no doubt some lives were lost as a result. So what about the argument that politicians dithered and delayed in the face of clear advice to the contrary? The clue to this one came in what we'd already heard the scientists say themselves. Neither Ferguson nor Edmund said that it would have been easy to go earlier with things that they were at the time. And we now know from the minutes of the SAGE committee meetings, SAGE was the key government scientific advisory group, the scientific advisors were not calling for lockdown. These weren't just epidemiologists, they included behaviour specialists. And they had seen authoritarian China imposing a full lockdown, and they'd thought, not unreasonably, that democratic societies would never go along with such draconian measures. I kind of remember a lot of us saying something like that at the time, to be fair. That impression was challenged on March the 11th, when Italy, which had by then reached over 800 deaths, ordered a national lockdown. And that, according to Professor John Edmonds, that action opened up the policy space. At that point, Boris Johnson gave his grave message to the public, telling them to prepare for difficult times ahead. On the 13th, Professor Edmonds gave an interview where he said the only way to stop this epidemic is indeed to achieve herd immunity. So that was still broadly the advice the government was being given. On the 16th, Neil Ferguson presented his report that for the first time suggested that the mitigation policy the government was following would result in 250,000 deaths, 500,000 if they weren't following any policy at all. But contrary to what many believe, that study didn't call for a full lockdown. It didn't model the effects of a full lockdown. It modelled school closures, social distancing, household quarantine for people with symptoms. It said that virus suppression measures might need to be maintained for 18 months or more before a vaccine was produced, and that any relaxation of measures would see the re-emergence of the virus. Hence, you wouldn't want to do a full lockdown because it would be impossible to sustain for 18 months, and once relaxed it would simply go back to how it was. It said this: suppression, while successful to date in China and South Korea, carries with it enormous social and economic costs, which may themselves have significant impact on health and well-being in the short and medium term. This was reinforced in another presentation to the House of Commons Select Committee recently by Professor Woolhouse, Professor of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at the University of Edinburgh. He said this: with hindsight, when should the lockdown have been initiated? That is too simple a question. What I need to know as an epidemiologist and modeller is how hard the lockdown is. How long do you want it to be? And what are you going to do afterwards? If you can give me details of the planning that goes into the lockdown and post-lockdown stage, I can give you an answer on the best time to implement lockdown. But it is very simplistic to say all as soon as possible. You could make an argument for whether we should have locked down way back in February. I think that at the time, you and most other people would have said that was a very disproportionate response given the situation at the time. Timing is a difficult thing in this sort of situation. And that was followed by a Professor Keeling, who said the early assumption was that lockdown probably was not sustainable for more than 4 to 5 weeks, and that we have already seen that that is blatantly not true. We vastly underestimated the general public and how reasonable they can be in the face of such an outbreak. In the event, on the 16th, Johnson promptly told people to stop non-essential contact with others, to work from home where possible, and to avoid public venues. He told people with symptoms to self-isolate. On March the 20th, he closed those public venues, and then on the 23rd he announced full lockdown. On March the 25th, Professor Ferguson appeared before the Select Committee and at that stage predicted no more than 20,000 deaths, the opposite extreme to where he had been. When asked in his recent presentation how come those figures were only half of what actually happened, he said that in the first 2 weeks in March, the UK probably had 1,500 to 2,000 infections imported from Italy and Spain, which was a much heavier initial seeding of the virus than they had expected. And they hadn't anticipated the failures of policy allowing the virus to get into care homes to the extent that it did. The release of the minutes of the SAGE advisory group, which some had hoped would give evidence that the government had been ignoring the advice, actually confirmed the opposite, that the government was following the advice it was given to a fault. Arguably, the government has been too timidly following advice and not actively enough exercising political judgment. But that's a topic for another time. So in summary, Would we have saved half of all the lives if we'd locked down a week earlier? I'm reluctant to conclude that two different epidemiologists who say that we would must be wrong based on one research paper. I am in no ways an expert. And if I choose that paper over those experts, it's quite possible I'd be doing that because of my own personal preference, because I have no way of judging which of them is correct. The paper does exist, and he does make the case and support it with evidence, and Norway has acknowledged the data says the same in their case and has agreed that it does seriously raise that question. So you would have to conclude at the very least that it seems uncertain, unproven. What should perhaps more be the point of focus is how the care homes were allowed to be so vulnerable. There seems some pretty solid agreement that you could have actually halved the numbers if that hadn't been the case. Was our entry into lockdown put back because of dither and delay in the face of advice to the contrary? No evidence of that from the various pieces of testimonies and meeting minutes. I think we actually went in quite strong. There are good cases to be made that skill in execution has been lacking in the mid to latter stages in terms of the management of the crisis, particularly in communication. But it's very easy to underestimate after the event the extraordinary measures that have been taken, the pace at which scientists were asked to work, and the scope of what actually was achieved in spite of all of the odds against. Personally, I think we're better served by focusing on what we should do better if there's a second wave, rather than just finding someone to blame. I doubt that will be the majority view, but there it is. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below.